Silas Boone woke to a fist pounding on his door before the sky had even turned gray, and by the time he crossed the cabin floor with his rifle half raised, his heart was already slamming harder than the knock itself. He threw the door open expecting trouble, a stray, a thief, a drunk off the Tillman Road, but what stood on his porch stopped the breath in his chest. An old Apache man stood there alone, no horse, no weapon, his braided gray hair loose around a face carved deep with exhaustion and something closer to desperation. 1 hour, the old man said, before Silas could speak a word. That is all I ask of you. Silas lowered the rifle an inch but did not open the door wider. 3 years of quiet distance sat between him and every Apache family on this side of the territory, an unspoken agreement that neither side crossed the other's fence line, born from a grief neither of them spoke aloud. He had never once been approached like this, not at dawn, not alone, not with such raw urgency in an old man's eyes. "You've got no business at my door," Silas said, though his voice carried less certainty than his words. The old man did not flinch. He simply held Silas's gaze the way a man holds a rope he knows is fraying. "My grandson is dying in the rock country," the elder said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I cannot reach him alone. And if my own people are seen riding toward the ridge before sunrise, the soldiers at the pass will not ask why." He did not explain further. He did not beg. He simply waited, the silence between them heavier than anything Silas had carried in a long while, and somewhere behind that silence was a question Silas could not yet answer. Why him, of all the ranchers scattered across this valley, had this man chosen his door to knock on? Silas glanced back once at the small shape curled beneath a quilt near the hearth, his daughter Etta, 9 years old and sound asleep, unaware her father was being asked to gamble everything on a stranger's word. He thought of the fence he had built around his life since Naomi died, the careful distance he kept from anything that might cost him more than he had left to give. And yet something in the old man's face refused to let him shut the door. Against every instinct sharpened by loss, Silas reached for his hat. They rode out together before the first gray light touched the ridge line, two men who had never exchanged more than a nod across a fence post now moving as one shadow toward the rock country. The old man rode Silas's second horse with the ease of someone twice his age had no right to carry, his eyes fixed forward, his jaw set against whatever waited ahead. Neither spoke. The only sound was hooves against frost-hardened ground and the old man's breath, quick and shallow, betraying a fear he refused to show in his face. As the trail narrowed and the canyon walls rose dark on either side, Silas felt the full weight of what he had just agreed to. An hour that could cost him his standing in town, his safety, perhaps far more than either. He did not yet know the old man's name. He did not know what waited at the end of this ride, or why fate had chosen his door before sunrise. He only knew, with a certainty that unsettled him more than any danger the canyon could hold, that this hour was going to change the shape of his life before the sun ever cleared the ridge. The rock country swallowed the last of the moonlight as they climbed, and Silas found himself studying the old man's profile in the gray half-light, trying to read what kind of desperation drove a grandfather to risk everything on a closed door he had never once knocked on before. Toclani rode with his shoulders square and his eyes forward, betraying nothing except the white-knuckled grip he kept on the reins, a grip that told Silas more than any words could about how close to breaking this composed old man truly was. Somewhere in that silent climb, Silas realized he had stopped thinking about the risk to himself entirely, and started thinking only about how much time remained before the sun cleared the ridge. Silas Boone had not always kept his gate closed to the world. 6 years earlier, before fever took his wife Naomi in a single brutal week, their small ranch had been a place where strangers were fed before they were questioned. Naomi had been the kind of woman who believed a closed door was a wasted chance at kindness, and she had said so often enough that Silas could still hear her voice in the empty rooms of the house he had built for her. After she died, he sealed himself off the way a wound seals itself with scar tissue, not healed, just hardened, and easier to bear that way. The old man's name, Silas learned as they rode, was Toclani, an elder of a small band camped in the high country beyond the ridge. Toclani had lost his only son 11 years past, in the same wave of violence between settlers and his people that had claimed Silas's younger brother on the other side of the same conflict. Neither man said this aloud, but each seemed to sense it in the other, the particular stillness of a man who has buried someone the world insists he should hate for. It was a strange, unspoken kinship neither had asked for and neither could name. Etta had never known her mother's fence-crossing kindness firsthand, only the quieter, more guarded version of her father that had raised her since. She was a sturdy, watchful child who had learned early to read the weather of a room before speaking, and Silas often wondered, in the rare moments he let himself wonder anything at all, whether she had inherited more of her mother's open heart than his own closed one. It was for her sake as much as anyone's that he had built his fences so carefully after Naomi died, certain that loss was a debt best paid alone, without risking a child's heart on top of his own. Toclani's grandson, a boy of 14 named Taji, was the last living piece of his son that remained to him. The boy had gone out at dusk the evening before to track a strayed mule and had not returned. A search by moonlight had found only his hat, caught on a broken ledge above a narrow ravine deep in rock country. Toclani had known, the instant he saw that ledge, that no one from his camp could reach it before sunrise without being spotted by the cavalry patrol that swept the pass at first light, a patrol known to shoot first and account for it later when it came to Apache riders moving before dawn. Silas had heard of the patrol's reputation, the same one that had made men in town proud and made men like Toclani afraid to travel their own land in daylight. It was a truth he had let sit comfortably unexamined for years, tucked behind his own grief, his own fences. Riding now beside a man whose fear was not abstract but immediate and specific, Silas felt that comfortable distance begin to crack for the first time since Naomi's death, though he was not yet ready to admit how deeply. Taji's father, Toclani's son, had died trying to protect a group of women and children caught between two armed camps during a skirmish neither side fully remembered starting anymore, and Toclani had raised the boy himself in the years since, teaching him to track, to ride, to read the sky before a storm the way his own father had taught him. Losing Taji now, on some forgotten ledge in the rock country, would mean losing the last living thread connecting Toclani to a son he had already buried once, and that thought alone had been enough to send an old man walking 3 miles in the dark to a stranger's door. As they climbed higher into the rock country, Toclani spoke of his son in fragments, the way a man speaks of something he has folded carefully and never quite unfolded again. "My son used to say a rope is only as strong as the man who trusts it," he said quietly, watching the trail ahead. "Not the strongest rope. The trusted one." Silas said nothing, but the words settled into him strangely, the way a phrase sometimes does before a man understands why it will matter later. He filed it away without knowing it would return to him, transformed, before the year was through. By the time the canyon walls closed in tighter and the trail turned to loose scree beneath the horses' hooves, an understanding had formed between the two men that neither had spoken outright, that this ride was no longer only about the boy on the ledge. It was about two men who had spent years building walls against the very thing that was now, however reluctantly, beginning to dismantle them. Silas gripped the reins tighter, aware that whatever waited at the ravine, he would not ride back through that canyon the same man who had ridden in. They left the horses tethered at the last stand of scrub pine and covered the final stretch on foot, the trail narrowing to a ledge barely wide enough for one man's boots. Toclani moved faster than his years should have allowed, driven by a fear he no longer bothered to hide, while Silas followed close behind, counting silently the minutes slipping away toward sunrise and whatever the pass might bring with it. Neither man spoke now. There was nothing left to say that the urgency in their pace didn't already say louder. The ravine, when they reached it, was worse than either man had feared. Taji lay wedged on a narrow shelf of rock some 20 feet below the trail, one leg twisted beneath him at a wrong angle, his face pale with cold and blood loss from a gash along his scalp. He was conscious, barely, his eyes finding his grandfather's face above him with a flicker of relief that cut through Silas like a blade. Toclani's composure, held so carefully the entire ride, finally broke into a single sharp breath, and in that breath Silas understood exactly how much this old man had risked simply by knocking on his door. There was no time to send for help and no rope long enough among Toclani's meager supplies to reach the shelf safely. Silas's coil, the one he kept looped behind his saddle out of habit more than need, was the only chance either of them had. He worked fast, lashing it to the saddle horn and testing his horse's footing on ground that could crumble without warning, aware the whole while that the sun was climbing and the patrol would not wait for sentiment. Toclani steadied the horse's head with hands that had gone from trembling to iron still, the fear in him now channeled entirely into purpose. Lowering himself over the ledge, Silas felt the rock shift twice beneath his boots before he reached the boy, and each time his stomach dropped with the certainty that the whole shelf might give way beneath them both. Taji gripped his forearm with more strength than his condition should have allowed, his eyes locked on Silas's face with a wordless plea that needed no translation. "I've got you," Silas said, low and steady, though he was not entirely certain it was true yet. It was the same phrase he remembered Naomi using on a frightened calf once, years ago, and it steadied his own hands as much as the boy's. Hauling Taji up the rock face took longer than the hour Toclani had asked for, each foot of progress a negotiation with loose stone and failing light and a boy slipping in and out of consciousness. Somewhere in that climb, the last of Silas's hesitation about this whole reckless morning burned away entirely, replaced by something sharper and more immediate, the simple, unarguable fact that a child's life was now entirely in his hands, and he intended to keep it there safely. Toclani's voice above him never wavered, a low steady stream of words in his own language that Silas did not understand but recognized instantly as prayer. They reached the top of the ravine just as the first true light broke gold along the eastern ridge, the exact moment Toclani had feared the patrol would appear on the pass below. For a long, breathless minute, all three of them lay flat against the rock, listening for hoofbeats that never came, the patrol apparently delayed or diverted by some mercy none of them had earned but all of them needed. Silas allowed himself one shaking breath of relief before turning his attention fully to Taji's leg, already swelling badly beneath the boy's torn trouser leg. It was Pruitt, Silas's nearest neighbor and a man who had never hidden his opinions about Apache families camping anywhere near the valley, who spotted them on the trail back toward town. He reined his horse up hard at the sight of Silas leading two Apache riders, one of them clearly injured, straight down the public road in full daylight. "You lost your senses, Boone?" Pruitt called out, loud enough to be heard by the two ranch hands riding behind him. "Bringing that trouble right through the middle of town?" The word trouble landed on Silas harder than he expected, considering the boy bleeding across his saddle. Toclani said nothing to Pruitt's accusations, his attention fixed entirely on his grandson's pale face, but Silas saw the old man's jaw tighten in a way that told him this was not the first time Toclani had swallowed words like these in front of men who would never bother learning his name. It struck Silas, watching that quiet restraint, how much strength it must take to absorb insult after insult simply to keep a child alive, and how little of that strength the men shouting from their saddles would ever be asked to summon themselves. Silas had a choice in that moment that would define every conversation about him in town for months afterward. He could hand the boy off at the edge of the valley, let Toclani's people carry him the rest of the way alone, and ride home with his reputation intact and his fences undisturbed. Instead, he kept riding straight through the center of town toward the doctor's house, Pruitt and his men trailing behind muttering, townsfolk stepping out onto porches to watch the spectacle of a rancher openly delivering an injured Apache boy to Doc Waller's door in broad daylight, no explanation offered or owed. "He's a child," Silas said simply, when Pruitt demanded to know what exactly he thought he was doing associating himself with people who'd brought nothing but trouble to this valley for years. "That's the whole explanation you're getting." It was not a loud declaration, not the speech a man makes when he wants to convince a crowd of anything. It was quiet and final, the voice of a man who had stopped needing anyone's approval somewhere back on that rock ledge, and it landed harder in its plainness than any argument could have. Doc Waller, to his credit, asked no questions Silas couldn't answer honestly, setting Taji's broken leg with practiced hands while Toclani stood at the boy's side, refusing to leave even when Pruitt lingered outside muttering to anyone who would listen. It was in the quiet after, while Taji slept off the worst of the pain under Doc Waller's roof, that Toclani finally told Silas why he had chosen his door before any other in the valley, a truth that reached back further than either man had realized during the ride into the rock country. 11 years ago, Toclani said, watching his grandson's chest rise and fall steadily for the first time since the ravine, a woman came to our camp when my wife lay dying of fever. She was not welcomed there. She came anyway, alone, with medicine and no fear in her eyes, and she stayed 3 days until the fever broke. He turned to look at Silas fully for the first time since they had met at the door. Her name, she told us, was Naomi. The words landed on Silas like a physical blow, the past folding suddenly and completely into the present. He thought back, standing there, to the handful of times over the years he'd found Naomi's saddlebag missing certain herbs, or noticed a stretch of days when she rode out alone and returned saying little beyond a tired smile. He had never questioned it, too absorbed in the daily work of the ranch to wonder where her quiet disappearances led, and it struck him now with a fresh, sharp grief that there had been an entire second life to his wife's kindness that he had never once thought to ask about. Silas had never known. Naomi had never spoken of it, not once in all their years together, and he understood now, standing in Doc Waller's quiet front room, exactly the kind of woman he had lost and exactly how far her quiet courage had traveled beyond anything he had witnessed himself. "She never told me," he said finally, his voice rough. "Not once." Toclani nodded slowly, unsurprised. "Some kindnesses are not meant to be counted," he said. "Only carried forward, when the moment finally calls for them again." It was, Silas realized, precisely what had happened at his door before sunrise. The decision facing Silas now was no longer about one dangerous hour already survived, but about what came after, whether he would let this single morning close back into the same careful distance he had lived behind since Naomi's death, or whether he would let it stay open the way she always had. Pruitt's voice outside, still grumbling to a shrinking audience, no longer carried the weight it once might have. Silas looked at Toclani, at Taji sleeping peacefully under clean bandages, and understood that his wife's fence-crossing kindness 11 years ago had just saved a boy's life through him, whether he had known it or not. He thought of Etta again, asleep at home unaware of any of this, and understood that whatever example he set in this doorway would shape the kind of man she believed her father to be for the rest of her life. A closed gate had felt like safety for 6 long years, but standing here now, watching an old man's hand still resting protectively on his grandson's shoulder, Silas understood that safety and rightness were not always the same thing, and that Naomi had known the difference long before he ever would. "Bring your people down to the south pasture when the weather turns," Silas said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. "There's good shelter along the creek, better than anything up in that rock country come winter." It was not a grand gesture, not a speech, just a practical offer between two men who understood exactly what such an offer cost and meant in a valley like this one. Toclani studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand, an American gesture offered deliberately, respectfully, in the language of the man standing in front of him. "Then we are neighbors now," he said, "and neighbors remember." By the following winter, the worst blizzard the valley had seen in a decade buried the roads for 11 days and left Silas's cattle scattered and starving in drifts higher than a man's waist, his stores of feed and firewood dwindling fast while Etta grew feverish from a chill that would not break under the thin blankets he had left. He was, for the first time since Naomi died, entirely out of options and entirely alone against a threat too large for one man's hands to solve, the same helpless silence pressing in on him that Toclani must have felt pounding on a stranger's door. It was Toclani who came again before sunrise, this time with a dozen riders behind him, sacks of dried meat and medicine bundled against their saddles, moving through drifts that would have turned back any patrol. They dug Silas's cattle free from the snow, packed Etta's fever with herbs Toclani's own wife had once used to save a stranger's life, and stayed 3 full days until the worst of the storm broke and the child's breathing came easy again. Silas stood in his own doorway watching them work and understood, fully now, what his wife had always known, that a rope is only as strong as the man who trusts it, and some debts of kindness only grow larger the longer they travel. Word of what Toclani's band had done for the Boone Ranch spread through the valley faster than the storm itself had, and this time it was Pruitt who found himself with little to say when neighbors asked whether the stories were true. Some things, Silas discovered, could not be argued away once a dozen riders had been seen digging a white rancher's cattle free from the snow with their own hands, expecting nothing in return but the shelter they'd already been promised months before. The valley did not change its mind all at once, but it changed, slowly, the way frost gives way to thaw. Spring came slow that year, but it came, green finally breaking through drifts that had seemed permanent only weeks before, and Silas Boone stood at his fence line one clear morning watching Taji ride past on a horse of his own, leg fully healed, laughing at something his grandfather had said. The old fences Silas had built around his own heart were gone now, replaced by something sturdier and far less lonely, a rope tied not by blood or law, but by 2 mornings, years apart, when a stranger had knocked before sunrise and asked for nothing but 1 hour of trust. Somewhere behind him, Etta's laughter carried across the yard as she chased a barn cat through the new grass, healthy and unaware of how close that winter had come to taking everything from her, and Silas allowed himself, for the first time in 6 years, to simply stand still and let the morning be enough. A closed door had once felt like the only way to survive his grief. An open one, he now understood, was the only way to survive it and still call the life that followed a good one. It had been enough, in the end, to change everything. If you were in Silas's place, a closed door, a grieving heart, and a stranger's desperate knock before sunrise, would you have opened it?